Hey guys, tonight we begin with a curious little jar tucked away beneath the floorboards of a dim cottage. The fire has burned low, the moonlight casts long shadows, and you're crouched over something that smells vaguely like moldy thyme mixed with rot. A thick salve, dark, greasy, spiked with crushed henbane and belladonna. You dip 2 fingers in. You don't eat it. You rub it into your skin. Or, if you're feeling particularly daring, you straddle a broomstick and rub it into more sensitive areas. You already feel your heartbeat rising, a flush, a warmth, then a floating sensation. No, you're not flying. Not really. But your brain thinks you are. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink. The walls are soft and breathing. A cow in the corner now wears a bishop's hat and chants Latin. And you are flying through the air, soaring over fields and forests like a tiny, disoriented deity. Is it witchcraft, or just some poorly documented medieval pharmacology? Welcome to the world of witches' ointments, a recipe not for beauty, but for blissful disconnection. These psychoactive unguents were often made from a disturbing cocktail of plants like deadly nightshade, henbane, datura, and monkshood. Just reading the ingredient list could kill you. Used primarily by folk healers and accused witches, these ointments bypassed the stomach and went straight through the skin or mucous membranes. Why? Because many of these herbs are extremely toxic when ingested, but applied topically. They produce vivid hallucinations, floating sensations, out-of-body experiences, and if you're not careful, cardiac arrest. The infamous flying witches of early modern folklore may not have taken to the skies on stormy nights, at least not physically, but in their minds, through those ointments, they soared. Some recipes even involved the witch's staff, yes, a literal stick, coated in ointment and used in a way I won't describe too directly, except to say it makes the phrase riding a broom feel a little too literal. This wasn't just peasantry gone wild. It may have been a means of managing trauma, escaping violence, or just surviving a relentlessly painful world. Imagine enduring an abusive household or endless childbearing, and knowing that an herb-infused trance was your only freedom. Of course, the church wasn't buying the "I just needed to chill" excuse. Hallucinations were immediately filed under demonic interference. A woman writhing under the effects of belladonna wasn't seeking enlightenment. She was clearly kissing Satan's backside at a coven orgy. Naturally, one woman's bad trip was another inquisitor's jackpot. And if your neighbor already hated your cooking or accused you of stealing her eggs, a sudden outburst or drugged fit in the night might land you on trial as a broomstick joyrider. Historians still argue whether these witch flights were ever truly widespread or mostly legend. Some claim real recipes existed and were used for centuries, while others say the entire idea was constructed later by panicked clerics trying to explain rural women having intense, sweaty dreams during a full moon. But the ointments themselves, those definitely existed. Some 15th century trial records preserve recipes remarkably similar to modern toxicology charts. Take a handful of belladonna, mix with goose fat. You know, the usual bedtime routine. What's even more fascinating is that some of these ingredients still have medical uses today, under carefully controlled conditions. Scopolamine, derived from henbane and nightshade, is used to treat motion sickness. In the right dose, it'll calm your nausea. In the wrong dose, you'll think the dog is the Pope and your ceiling is whispering betrayal. So, imagine you're not a witch. You're just someone aching to escape your physical body for a while. Tired from childbirth, grief, disease, or just the burden of being a woman in the year 1372. And someone tells you they have an ointment that'll let you drift outside yourself, float above the pain, even fly. You take it, you soar. And if the neighbors see you screaming at a tree in your nightdress, well, they probably won't call it wellness. Eventually, the ointments fall out of favor, not because they stopped working, but because trials and executions made experimenting a dangerous hobby. Still, the memory lingers. Flying dreams, tingling skin, a blurry line between healing, heresy, and high. And as your hallucination starts to fade, the cottage returns to normal. The broomstick is just a broom again. The cow is mooing, not singing, and the night grows quiet. For now, the chanting is gone now, and your feet are back on the floor, but not for long, because your next experience with medieval, altered states takes place behind thick monastery walls, where the stone corridors echo with whispered prayers, flickering candlelight, and, occasionally, involuntary visions of the Virgin Mary doing the cha-cha. Yes, it's time to step into the sandals of a monk. You rise before dawn, you chant in Latin, you sip something strange, not quite wine, not quite water. It tastes earthy, bitter, almost fungal. In fact, it might be fungal. Welcome to the blurred lines between divine rapture and chemical inspiration, especially in places where mushrooms grow wild, grain stores go moldy, and monks unknowingly turn communion into something closer to a rave. Now, let's be clear. Not every monk was tripping in the cloister, but in an era without microscopes, refrigeration, or germ theory, it was all too easy to mistake ergot-infected rye or psychoactive fungi for ordinary food. Ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on damp grain, contains alkaloids similar to LSD. It can cause spasms, hallucinations, and something called St. Anthony's fire, which is just as horrifying as it sounds. Imagine you're a monk in 12th century France. You've fasted for days. You're weak, sleep-deprived, possibly dehydrated. Then someone hands you a piece of rye bread, unknowingly laced with ergot. Your vision blurs. Your skin burns. The walls breathe. You fall to the floor, speaking in tongues. Your brothers gather around and declare you touched by God or cursed by the devil. It depends on who's watching. Historians still argue whether these spiritual visions were genuinely divine or chemically induced. The records describe holy figures bursting into tears during sermons, seeing tongues of fire during prayer, or falling into ecstatic convulsions, all considered signs of saintliness. But let's be honest, they also sound like someone who just chewed the wrong mushroom cap at lunch. There's also some speculation, again, debated, that certain monastic orders experimented with medicinal herbs and fermented drinks to deepen their meditative states. This wasn't party time. This was transcendence. Think less, let's get wasted, and more, let's find the face of God through this suspicious cup of pine-infused mead. You may not expect monks to be sipping mushroom tea, but many medieval religious communities brewed their own alcohol, meads, ales, wines, and these were sometimes flavored with herbs known for their calming or mildly psychoactive properties. Things like mugwort, wormwood, and yarrow were added to drinks for their supposed healing effects, or maybe for that little buzz that made evening prayers a bit more floaty. Not to mention, you're in an environment of constant spiritual striving, fasts, vigils, silence, and solitude. It's not hard to imagine that even a mild chemical shift might nudge your exhausted brain into territory it interprets as divine. There's even one 14th century mystic who described her visions as a warm fire pouring from behind her eyes and the colors of the Holy Spirit woven in blue and red. Beautiful, and maybe the result of a moldy biscuit. Of course, not all spiritual highs were accidental. Some were cultivated. In certain Christian traditions, particularly among mystics and anchorites, there was a belief that physical suffering brought you closer to the divine. Starvation, flagellation, isolation, all means of achieving a sort of divine delirium. Now, were they high? Not in the recreational sense. But did they enter altered mental states? Absolutely. And whether caused by faith, fungi, or fasting, the results were often the same: tears, visions, and lots of poetic Latin. A few even became saints. One particularly fascinating case is that of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who claimed to receive visions from God starting at a young age. Her descriptions are vivid, radiant, borderline psychedelic. She saw cosmic wheels, pulsing lights, rivers of flame pouring from heaven, and she turned those visions into music, medicine, and art. Modern scholars have suggested everything from migraines to ergot poisoning to divine inspiration. We may never know, but back in your monk sandals, the bells are ringing. You're back from your trance, shaky and covered in sweat, and the other brothers look at you in awe. You've had a vision. You've touched something sacred. You might even get your own saint day, or you just had a rough meal. Either way, someone's writing it down in the scriptorium, probably with excessive capital letters and marginal doodles of dragons. So while you may have thought of monasteries as solemn, quiet places, they were also hubs of accidental, and occasionally intentional, altered consciousness. And whether the cause was divine favor or fungal misfortune, the result was often the same: a very weird afternoon. Your robes are damp with sweat, your vision still a little swimmy, but now you've stumbled somewhere even more curious: the back room of a medieval apothecary. It smells like dried rose petals, mouse droppings, vinegar, and something bitter underneath. Something sticky and tar-like, stored carefully in a sealed ceramic jar. The label says opium poppy resin, though you can't read it. Doesn't matter. You're not here to study. You're here because your tooth feels like it's trying to kill you. You sit. The apothecary nods without speaking. He grinds a dark brown lump into powder, mixes it with honey, and gives you a spoonful. You swallow. Then you wait, and wait. And suddenly, the world softens. This is your first dose of medieval opium, also called theriac, laudanum, or sometimes just the strong syrup. And yes, they knew exactly what they were doing. While hallucinogenic ointments and wild mushrooms offered mystery and flight, opium brought warmth, heaviness, forgetting, derived from the dried sap of the Papaver somniferum poppy, the poppy that brings sleep. It was a well-established part of both Eastern and Western medicine by the High Middle Ages. You didn't need a war wound or battlefield trauma to receive it. A headache, a fever, heartbreak, or childbirth would do just fine. And sometimes, it didn't even come from a doctor. Traveling peddlers often sold miracle cures infused with opium, usually wrapped in a long list of mysterious ingredients to sound exotic and holy. Powder of unicorn horn, they'd say. Boiled emerald. But the real star was the sticky, sleepy stuff that made pain less sharp and time less important. The Greeks had used it. The Romans had loved it. And by the medieval period, opium had spread from Islamic medical texts back into Christian hands. Monks copied Arab treatises describing the preparation of theriac, a multi-ingredient compound that often included poppy latex, myrrh, cinnamon, and sometimes ground up viper. Why a viper? No one's sure. Maybe the spice of danger. Maybe just poor quality control. You recline on a worn straw mat, the pain in your jaw numbing into irrelevance. Your limbs go soft. A humming sensation creeps into your chest. For the first time in days, you don't want to scream. Of course, like all good things, there's a cost. Addiction wasn't fully understood, but dependency. That was obvious. People who took opium regularly were noted to become slow of wit, dull of eye, or perpetually dreamful. Sound familiar? There's even record of knights requesting poppy tinctures before battle, not to dull pain after injury, but to enter the fray already distant from it. One chronicle tells of a soldier who fought as if in mist and didn't flinch when he was stabbed. Heroic? Maybe. But also very, very drugged. Historians still argue whether medieval opium use was widespread or mostly limited to the elite and those with access to trade routes. The Crusades played a role here too. Soldiers returning from the East brought more than stories. They brought habits, herbs, and powders. Some accounts even describe the practice of smoking opium by those stationed far from home, though medieval pipes as we imagine them wouldn't appear until later. Still, there's speculation that opium was burned on charcoal braziers and inhaled in small chambers. And if you were particularly wealthy or well-connected, you might keep your own private stash. Some noble households had sleep boxes, little locked containers of dried herbs and potent syrups. Imagine a medieval medicine cabinet crossed with a minibar. Nightmares? Cramps? Existential dread about dying of plague? There was a dose for that. Not all uses were medicinal either. Some seekers, particularly mystics, alchemists, and early occultists, experimented with poppy-based elixirs to provoke altered states. Unlike the monks who claimed divine visions, these folks were chasing something murkier: knowledge, contact with the beyond, or a moment of pure detachment. The line between healer and addict, between visionary and wanderer, was always thin. Let's also not forget childbirth. If you're a woman in labor in 1274 and screaming into your shawl, someone might press a cloth to your lips soaked in diacodium, a syrup of poppy, honey, and sometimes vinegar. Does it stop the pain? Not entirely, but it might make you care a little less. And in a time when birth was a gamble and comfort was rare, that mattered. Even animals weren't exempt. There's a 14th century veterinary text that advises giving horses a few drops of poppy milk to calm them before battle. Did it work? Maybe. Or maybe the horses just stood there blinking, wondering why everything suddenly felt like it was underwater. As with everything in the medieval world, knowledge was half guesswork, half tradition. Some uses were wise, others were reckless, and sometimes pain relief crossed into oblivion. The apothecary stirs beside you. He offers another dose. You consider it. But already the edges of your vision are fading. The room rocks gently, like a boat at anchor. Outside, the street noise fades into a faraway hum. Sleep tugs at your eyelids, not gently, but insistently. And whether you're healing or escaping, it hardly matters now. You're high, and for a few precious hours in a very hard century, you are not in pain. Your eyes flutter open, though it takes a second to remember where or even when you are. The apothecary is gone. So is the gentle haze. But the clamor outside is back, louder now. You shuffle toward it and find yourself stumbling into a crowd. Laughter, music, shouting. Someone just dropped a pie. Someone else is throwing dice against a church wall. A man is relieving himself very publicly and then proceeds to serenade a goose. Congratulations, you're at a medieval alehouse, and nearly everyone here is drunk. Not just tipsy, not just relaxed, absolutely plastered. And you might be thinking, wait, weren't medieval people super religious? Yes. But also, they drank beer like it was water. Because, well, it was. In much of medieval Europe, water was a gamble, especially in towns, where runoff from tanneries, cesspits, and butchers turned local wells into disease soup. So, for safety and flavor, people of all ages, yes, even toddlers, drank ale. It was mildly alcoholic, low in hops, and brewed fresh in households or taverns. You didn't sip it to get wasted. But if you sipped it all day, every day, yeah, things got blurry. It's late afternoon. You're crammed into a wooden bench beside 3 shepherds, 2 merchants, and what might be a tax collector in disguise. Everyone's sweating. The floor is sticky, and the air smells like cabbage, old wood, and regret. A round is ordered, then another, and another. By the 4th, someone's trying to dance on a barrel. It doesn't end well. Public drunkenness was so common that moralists of the time wrote sermons specifically warning against alehouse sins. There were warnings about lechery, fighting, idle speech, vomiting on Sunday, and, one favorite, bawdy singing whilst trousers are loose. A classic. Still, no one was quitting. Ale wasn't just a drink. It was part of the economy. Women especially were central to brewing culture, often running brew houses from home. Some of them even wore tall, pointed hats. Yes, those hats. To stand out in the marketplace and let customers find them easily. Sound familiar? That's right. Some scholars believe the iconography of witches may partly trace back to female brewers. Historians still argue whether these women were persecuted for their profession or for simply being successful in a male-dominated economy. Probably both. Anyway, back to the fun. Drinking wasn't confined to taverns. It spilled into fairs, church feasts, even funerals. People drank while praying, while giving birth, while negotiating dowries. The term was sailing, now linked to Christmas songs, originally described groups going door to door singing while drinking heavily. Holiday cheer indeed. And it wasn't just beer. Mead, fermented honey, and cider were also common. The wealthy had wine, and sometimes really creative concoctions like lamb's wool, hot ale with roasted apples, sugar and spices, or braggot, a mead beer hybrid that could floor a night if brewed too strong. You might expect the church to intervene. And it did, sort of. Drinking was fine in moderation, but drunkenness was framed as a gateway to sin. The problem? Moderation was hard to define when ale was your morning beverage. Imagine trying to figure out if your breakfast counted as a sin. I only had 3 pints, Brother Thomas. There's even record of priests staggering through Mass, having imbibed one too many blessed beverages. Monasteries brewed their own beer, and some became so good at it that their products were sought across Europe. So if you're picturing quiet, sober monks copying Bibles, remember, they were also inventing double-fermented abbey ales with alarming potency. The peasantry, meanwhile, celebrated with a kind of boozy resilience. After harvests, they drank. After plagues, they drank harder. There's a grim little proverb that goes, "Death will come, but ale comes first." And don't forget seasonal festivals. May Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas. Each a perfect excuse for getting obliterated in a field while wearing leaves on your head and declaring eternal love to a sheep. Hopefully not literally. If you lived in a medieval town, getting drunk wasn't a vice. It was basically a hobby. One chronicler even describes an event in 1353 where an entire village became so intoxicated during a local saint's feast that they collectively forgot to bury the actual relic. They found it 3 days later in a pickle barrel. Of course, some authorities did try to regulate the fun. London had laws limiting ale strength, and some towns implemented closing hours, though enforcing them was another story. A popular workaround? Just move the party to someone's barn. Boom. Instant pop-up pub. In the middle of all this, you might wonder, were people really getting high or just drunk? Well, when you drink strong mead on an empty stomach, sing for 6 hours, then dance in clogs under a full moon, the result is more than tipsiness. It's communal euphoria, chemical disinhibition. You lose yourself in it. You float. You're now on your 5th ale. The goat at the door is wearing a flower crown. Someone is balancing a spoon on his nose and quoting Aristotle. You're not sure if the stars are spinning or if you are. But you feel warm, human, momentarily free, and in a world full of pain, war, hunger, and saints whispering judgments from every church window. Maybe that's all you needed. The crowd fades behind you, leaving only the echo of clumsy songs and the slosh of last drinks. You step through the town gate into the night, only to be greeted by the strange smell of incense, hashish smoke, and something roasted over spiced coals. This isn't Europe anymore. You've arrived at the edge of the medieval world, in a place crusaders whispered about in equal parts fear and fascination, the Islamic East. The year is somewhere between the 11th and 13th centuries. You're in Syria, or maybe Egypt, possibly Persia. The details are fuzzy, like your vision. A soft pipe is pressed into your hands by a man with silver rings and coal-lined eyes. He nods toward the mouthpiece. You hesitate, then inhale. Hashish. Sticky, resinous, sun-warmed. The taste is sharp and sweet. The smoke curls into your lungs like velvet. Then, you feel it. Not all at once. Slowly, the muscles in your face relax. Time begins to bend, and your thoughts stretch out like threads in a loom. To Europeans of the time, this was pure sorcery. To the locals, just Tuesday. You're now encountering the drug culture of the medieval Islamic world, one that was far more advanced, medically and recreationally, than most of what you've seen in Europe. Hashish, derived from the same cannabis sativa plant as marijuana, was used not only in religious mysticism and healing, but also, in some circles, for leisure, especially among the poor, the wandering, and certain mystic groups like the Sufis. Historians still argue whether hashish use among these groups was widespread or more mythologized by outsiders. But we do know that hashish was consumed in edible form, smoked, or even baked into sweet treats. Some users called it the herb of insight. Others used it to deepen prayer, enhance storytelling, or just get through a long night in the desert. And then there were the infamous hashashin. Yes, the root word of assassin. Western chroniclers described them as a secretive sect of Nizari Ismailis who used hashish to induce trance-like states before sending young men on suicidal missions. Supposedly, they'd be drugged, shown a paradise-like garden full of women, wine, and music, then told, "Kill in the name of Allah, and you'll return here forever." It's a gripping tale, and likely exaggerated. Modern scholars suspect the drugged assassin narrative was mostly a European invention, used to exoticize and demonize Muslim factions during the Crusades. The Ismailis themselves left behind philosophical texts and political treatises, not stoner poetry and blood-stained bongs. But whether the hashish claims were literal or symbolic, they stuck. Europeans came back from the East muttering wild stories of drug-fueled cults and pleasure gardens hidden behind fortress walls. And they brought back more than stories. Traders, knights, and travelers began experimenting. Cannabis plants started appearing in European herbal texts, not often and usually in vague terms, but enough to raise eyebrows. Some translations even lumped hashish in with mandrake and henbane, dubbing it a sleep herb of foreign lands. A few curious monks likely tried it. A few apothecaries almost certainly did. And of course, some people just enjoyed it. There's one particularly colorful, if semi-apocryphal account of a 13th century merchant who returned from Constantinople with hashish candies and accidentally gave one to a bishop during Lent. The bishop was last seen dancing barefoot in the cloisters, declaring himself the Prince of Fish. He resigned a week later. In the Islamic world, though, hashish faced its own backlash. While alcohol was forbidden under Sharia law, Hashish lived in a kind of legal gray zone. Some scholars condemned it as immoral. Others shrugged and suggested moderation. The Sufis, ever poetic, claimed it opened the eye of the heart, a beautiful phrase for being kind of baked and super into metaphysics. Back in your smoky den, someone plays a reed flute. A low drum taps a heartbeat rhythm. You close your eyes. You feel the earth as round and endless beneath you, not flat and cruel. Your body, still. But your thoughts, dancing. Hashish wasn't a miracle. It didn't cure the plague, but it offered a few hours of peace. And when you lived in a society riddled with political upheaval, famine, and religious warfare, that was a kind of miracle all its own. There's one last puff left in the pipe. You take it, slowly. The smoke moves through you like a story you almost remember from childhood. The lamplight flickers. The music fades. You're not flying. You're not dancing. But for now, at least, you are weightless. Morning creeps in, soft and yellow, and with it comes the clink of metal tools and the rustle of crushed leaves. You're no longer in an exotic den or a drunken tavern. You're crouched beside a barefoot village herbalist in a woolen shawl, carefully pinching the leaves of a mandrake plant. She tells you not to pull it directly. It screams, she whispers, before tying it to a goat's tail. You blink, wait. What? And just like that, you're back in rural Europe, where getting high wasn't necessarily glamorous, but it was surprisingly accessible. You didn't need a monastery or a merchant caravan. Sometimes all you needed was a garden. This is the realm of herbal highs, where the line between medicine, magic, and mild psychosis was thin at best. Villagers across medieval Europe often turned to plants like henbane, mandrake, hemlock, and datura, all of which contain psychoactive alkaloids capable of inducing hallucinations, euphoria, sedation, or, death. Side effects may include talking to trees and temporarily forgetting how breathing works. Let's start with henbane. Known for its sedative and hallucinogenic properties, henbane was used in everything from sleep potions to painkillers to, allegedly, love spells. You'd find it in balms and poultices, especially for treating toothaches and insomnia, or just for feeling loose, as one old herbal notes in Latin with barely disguised enthusiasm. Then there's mandrake, shaped vaguely like a human figure, if that human had been badly drawn by a sleepy child. Mandrake roots had a reputation stretching back to the ancient world. When dug up, they were believed to shriek so loudly they could kill you on the spot, hence the goat trick. Sound familiar? Yep, Harry Potter didn't invent that. In practice, mandrake root contains compounds like scopolamine and atropine, which can produce vivid hallucinations, delirium, and a powerful sense of disassociation. Some users described visions of floating, glowing people. Others just blacked out and woke up 3 days later naked in a river. Historians still argue whether mandrake was truly used recreationally, or if its terrifying effects made it strictly the tool of desperate healers and reckless charm makers. Still, recipes for mandrake sleep drafts survive in texts from as early as the 9th century. Some were used as anesthesia for surgery. a terrifying concept considering medieval surgical instruments included things like bone saws and forceps the size of fireplace tongs. But back to you. The herbalist crushes a bit of dried datura into a bowl and pours warm cider over it. She calls it moon tea. You're skeptical. You drink. Within minutes, your skin begins to tingle, and the world takes on a gentle warp, like you're walking through a melted tapestry. The trees sway even when the wind stops. The goat starts reciting riddles. Or maybe that's just your brain. In the village, such potions might be used for spiritual rituals, midwifery, or even dream divination. People believed dreams could reveal everything from the weather to the future of your crops. A few dried henbane seeds, a pinch of wild lettuce, and you might dream of your dead grandmother telling you to plant more onions. Of course, not every herb was meant for mind-bending journeys. Some were simply taken to dull hunger or relieve stress. Wild lettuce, sometimes called poor man's opium, was chewed to take the edge off fasting days. Valerian was steeped for nightmares. Poppy milk, even without full opium extraction, was fed to colicky children. Note: do not try this at home. One of the quirkiest records involves a medieval love potion made from elderflower, wine, and crushed toadstool, meant to loosen the heart and cloud the judgment, which is, come to think of it, also the tagline for most reality dating shows. You might be wondering, was any of this officially approved? Absolutely not. Church authorities regularly condemned herbalists, especially women, accusing them of witchcraft or sorcery. But here's the thing: people still used them. When you couldn't afford a physician, or if there wasn't one within 50 miles, you turned to the midwife, the wise woman, the apothecary. And often, her solutions weren't just practical. They were psychological. A trance-inducing brew didn't just treat illness, it treated fear. Historians still debate how widespread this kind of herbal self-medication was. Rural communities likely had pockets of deep knowledge passed orally, while others just guessed and hoped for the best. Some scholars suggest these trips weren't recreational at all, but accidental side effects of desperate medicine. But whether by accident or design, there were moments, real, documented moments, when medieval peasants found themselves high on their own homegrown supply. As your moon tea wears off, you stare at the clouds. They're not quite talking anymore. The trees look less smug, and the goat is back to just chewing grass instead of quoting Aristotle. But for a while, you felt weightless. You glimpsed something, whether divine or deeply weird, and returned with a story. And in a time when your average day involved mud, hunger, and mortal fear of spoiled meat, that story may have been the most precious medicine of all. You wake up with dried leaves in your hair and vague memories of a goat quoting riddles. But now, the light filtering through the trees feels different, brighter, not hallucinatory, just holy. And as your legs carry you down a forest path, the sounds shift too. No longer drunk laughter or herbal chants. Instead, bells, chanting, and a woman's voice crying out in ecstasy, not from pain or pleasure, but from divine rapture. You've wandered into the orbit of a visionary saint, and she's having a moment. You duck into the back of a stone chapel where a nun, young, pale, and trembling, is kneeling in front of a crucifix. Her lips are moving rapidly, though no words come out. Her hands twitch, her body sways. The other sisters say she's been blessed with a visitation from the Holy Spirit. You're not sure whether she's talking to God or just having a stroke. This is the blurry line between mystical ecstasy and what modern medicine might label seizure, psychosis, or drug reaction. But in the Middle Ages, these were often celebrated as miracles, proof of divine favor. And in many cases, there's reason to believe those saints might have been just a little chemically altered. Let's take St. Catherine of Siena. According to her own writings and witnesses, she experienced intense trances, ecstatic visions, and even physical transformations, like fasting to the point where she supposedly lived for months on nothing but the Eucharist. Modern scholars suggest that her brain may have been in a state of severe deprivation, producing vivid visions and a sense of floating disconnection. Or take Saint Teresa of Avila, technically a bit post-medieval, but too iconic to ignore. She described a spiritual experience where an angel pierced her heart with a golden spear, causing immense sweetness and a spiritual wounding so intense that she never wanted it to end. The statue of her in Rome shows her face mid-moan, which has led many modern viewers to raise an eyebrow and wonder whether she'd really just seen God, or maybe accidentally inhaled something interesting. Then there are the more local saints, ones you've never heard of, women, and sometimes men, who slipped into convulsions during Mass, spoke in unknown languages, or claimed to levitate. Some were likely epileptic. Others may have suffered from neurological disorders or malnutrition, but some might have been dabbling in medicinal madness. In certain circles, herbal brews were used to thin the veil between this world and the divine. Think henbane, belladonna, mandrake. Yes, again. And perhaps less dangerous herbs like wild thyme or valerian. A nun experiencing chronic pain or anxiety might be given a soothing potion. Then, floating in a semi-dreamlike state, she begins to see things. Holy things. Golden things. And just like that, boom, she's a mystic. Historians still argue whether these visions were faked, believed sincerely, or entirely physiological. Some claim these women craved attention or status. Others argue that these altered states were the result of genuine neurological or emotional conditions. And others suggest that the occasional involvement of psychoactive herbs can't be ruled out. One lesser-known tidbit: some saints described interactions with snakes, frogs, and animals speaking in human voices during visions. Not exactly standard biblical fare, but oddly in line with the known effects of certain hallucinogens. You might call it a coincidence. You might also call it henbane tea at bedtime. There's also the question of fasting-induced delirium. When you stop eating for long enough, your brain enters a state of starvation-induced euphoria. You lose sense of time. You may hallucinate. You may feel lifted out of your body. This wasn't just spiritual. It was chemical. Your neurons were running on fumes. And when combined with relentless prayer, chanting, and sensory deprivation, dim cloisters, candlelight, silence, those physical states easily morphed into profound religious experiences. If you've ever had a fever dream during a blackout, you already know the vibe. Let's not forget self-flagellation either. Some monks and ascetics believed that pain purified the soul, but pain also triggers endorphin release, your body's own morphine. After enough lashes, your body goes into shock. The result? Dissociation, ecstasy, visions of angels perhaps, or maybe just the floor talking to you in Latin. Even relics, bones of saints or scraps of cloth, were sometimes imbued with miraculous properties. But in some cases, miraculous just meant mysterious powders tucked inside reliquaries. Some anthropologists suggest that sniffing or kissing certain relics could have exposed devotees to mild psychoactives. Were these intentional? Or just moldy old bones doing their moldy old thing? Who knows? Either way, someone left the cathedral feeling very inspired. You watch the nun finally slump to the floor, tears drying on her cheeks, breathing shallow. The other sisters are murmuring prayers of awe. One rushes off to inform the bishop. You just sit there, trying to remember whether you drank anything weird this morning. You didn't, but she might have. The world of medieval sainthood was full of contradictions. Women who claimed visions were either revered or burned. Men who fasted until they hallucinated were praised as holy or mocked as mad. And yet, in a society aching for meaning, a good vision, whatever its origin, was worth everything. And maybe, just maybe, those visions made life a little easier to bear. You leave the chapel behind, its incense still clinging to your cloak, and wander into the town square, only to be swept up in something that feels like a carnival, a riot, and a religious ritual all rolled into one. People are spinning in circles, limbs flailing. Some are laughing, some are weeping. One man appears to be screaming at a loaf of bread. You don't know it yet, but you've just entered the heart of one of the strangest, most unsettling group highs in history. A dancing plague. Yes, dancing plague. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened in multiple cities across the 14th to 16th centuries, most famously in Strasbourg in 1518, when dozens, possibly hundreds, of people began to dance uncontrollably in the streets for days on end. They twirled until their feet bled, until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some reportedly died. And no, this isn't a metaphor. They danced themselves to death. But was it really dancing? Or something else? Some scholars think these outbreaks were a form of mass hysteria, psychogenic illness brought on by stress, fear, or trauma. And if you're thinking, well, what could possibly stress out medieval people? Let's review. Famine, plague, war, poverty, religious anxiety, demons behind every barn door. You get the idea. Others believe the cause might have been ergot poisoning again. Yes, the same moldy rye that possibly inspired visions in monasteries. The symptoms fit: convulsions, hallucinations, muscle spasms. In small doses, it could have affected entire communities eating the same infected bread. And some believe it was something more spiritual, perhaps even a form of ritual trance. In fact, the church initially responded to the dancing with processions and prayers, thinking it was a form of demonic possession or divine punishment. Later, they blamed heresy. Others blamed the heat, or full moons, or women's humors. Because of course. But for those in the trance, it felt real, urgent, necessary. Imagine being swept up in a rhythm you didn't choose, surrounded by others in the same state, your feet aching, but your body moving without permission. Eyewitnesses say dancers didn't respond to speech, didn't seem to feel pain, and didn't remember much after it ended. They twitched, they wept. Some sang hymns, some tore off their clothes. And it wasn't just dancing. There were other forms of collective ecstasy too. Flagellant movements, groups of men parading through towns, whipping themselves in rhythm, often entered trance-like states. They chanted, moaned. Some claimed to see visions mid-ritual. What started as penance could spiral into frenzy. There were also laughing epidemics, where people broke into uncontrollable laughter for hours or days, and biting outbreaks, where nuns or schoolchildren would start biting each other as if caught in a collective spell. Historians still argue whether these were true psychological conditions, spiritual episodes, or early descriptions of neurological illness. But they all shared one thing. They spread rapidly, visibly, and they left behind a wake of bruises, stories, and confusion. These events weren't isolated to villages either. Town councils documented them. Priests preached about them. Doctors shrugged and suggested bleeding. One German physician claimed the only cure for dancing mania was more dancing, just in a safe, enclosed space. So basically the world's first controlled rave. Interestingly, music was sometimes employed to guide the dancers to exhaustion. A band would be hired to play slowly, steadily, until the dancers collapsed in a more dignified way. It was less treatment and more controlled descent. Imagine a medieval DJ spinning lute bangers for a medical emergency. Were people getting high? Not in the way we think of it. But these episodes involved altered states of consciousness, collective ones, in fact. There was disassociation, visual hallucination, euphoria, grief, fear, and spiritual conviction all blending together in the open air. One observer in the 15th century described watching a woman dance for 12 hours straight with blood pouring from her feet. She sang psalms between sobs and kept going until she fainted. When she woke, she said she'd seen a vision of Saint Vitus, which is probably why these outbreaks became known as Saint Vitus's dance. It wasn't always horrifying, though. Some of these mass trances had celebratory aspects. In springtime festivals or midsummer rites, people danced in fields, sometimes under the influence of mildly psychoactive herbs or potent meads. These were planned, joyous highs, but when those rituals got disrupted by war or plague or church reformers, maybe the energy built up with nowhere to go and erupted in stranger ways. You watch now as the square begins to clear. A few dancers lie groaning in the dust. Others are weeping quietly. One is asleep, curled against a fountain. No one speaks. There's no explanation, just silence where ecstasy once lived. Whatever it was, mass trauma, bad bread, mystical vision, it happened. And the records are there. Strange, disjointed, but undeniably human. And you're left wondering, what kind of life makes losing control the most bearable option? In the end, maybe the dancing wasn't the madness. Maybe it was the medicine. Evening settles in again. The lamps are lit. The streets are quieter now. No dancers, no goats wearing flower crowns, no flying dreams whispered into the night. You sit beside a hearth, still wrapped in all you've seen and felt. The ointments, the poppy syrup, the monks sipping mystery brews, the saints convulsing in bliss, the villagers chasing visions in gardens and muddy fields. and the question begins to settle. Was anyone in the Middle Ages actually sober? The truth? Probably not. At least not the way we think of sobriety now. You see, medieval life wasn't just hard. It was relentlessly uncomfortable. Hunger, toothaches, childbirth without anesthesia, war wounds, the endless itch of lice, the rattle of disease in your lungs, the grief of losing 5 children before they reached age 5. Every day was another round in a brutal game with rules no one fully understood. And so, people found ways to escape, to blur the edges, to breathe differently, even just for a little while. Start with the basics: daily drinking. Ale, weak wine, small beer. These were staples, not because people wanted to get drunk, but because it was safer than water. Still, even low-alcohol drinks build up when consumed all day, every day. A medieval peasant might not be slurring, but they were certainly riding a permanent buzz from breakfast to bedtime. Then add the herbs. Nearly every home had a corner for healing greens, many of which doubled as mild sedatives or mood changers. Chamomile, mugwort, feverfew, hyssop. These weren't getting high in the modern sense, but they shifted things, made pain less sharp, made thoughts feel softer. Many were brewed into teas, some were smoked, others rubbed into skin. Your grandmother might give you a fennel and valerian tincture for melancholy, and no one would bat an eye. Then layer in accidents: moldy bread, spoiled grain, fungi in damp storage cellars. It didn't take much to unknowingly ingest something that tweaked your brain chemistry. No one understood ergot, after all. If someone started seeing angels or barking at the moon, it was rarely chalked up to contaminated rye. It was God, or demons, or maybe both, depending on your local priest. And of course, intentional highs existed too. The flying ointments, the poppy syrups, the love powders from the apothecary, the wine-soaked mandrake root tucked in the pocket of a nervous bride, the herbal draught slipped to a knight the night before battle, the mead infused with ash and rosemary that made you feel, just briefly, like a bear in a crown. Historians still argue about just how much of this was deliberate. Was it spiritual, medicinal, recreational? Probably a mix of all three. But what's clear is that altered states weren't rare. They were woven into the rhythms of daily life. Rituals, prayers, remedies, superstitions, and wild nights. There was no line between medicine and magic, no clean divide between sacred and strange. Even the church, for all its warnings, used incense in services, wine in sacraments, fasting as vision fuel, and music as a trance tool. You might leave Mass more dazed than you entered, glazed in candle smoke and Latin and distant bells. And don't forget how much pain people carried: physical, emotional, existential. If you're a peasant in 1328 with scurvy, a rotting molar, 4 dead siblings, and a vague sense that sin is leaking from your skin, can you blame anyone for chewing a few odd leaves and seeing what happens? So no, sobriety, as we imagine it now, wasn't the norm. The medieval world was full of little blurs, subtle disassociations, daily descents from full presence. Getting high didn't always mean escaping reality. Sometimes it was the only way to tolerate it. Now you're back in your quiet room, the fire's burning low. Outside, the wind picks up, carrying with it the soft smells of ash, earth, and faint rosemary. You're not flying, not floating, but something in your chest feels a little lighter. You've wandered through 1,000 strange paths tonight, and for a while, you weren't just observing history, you were inside it. Through smoke, through shadow, through the small human urge to forget. And now, you're tired. The world softens, the floor tilts gently, like a cradle. You don't need ointment, you don't need poppy tea. Just breath, just silence. Let it carry you out. You've seen the salves and the syrups, the sacred dreams and the dancing fits. You've walked through hazy cloisters and buzzing taverns, past herbal gardens where the plants whispered promises they couldn't always keep. And now, finally, you're still. Let the flickering images fall away. Let the buzz fade out. The broomstick is back in its corner. The apothecary has closed his shutters. The goat is asleep, hopefully not quoting Plato in his dreams. Even the saints have gone quiet now, their visions dimmed like candles before dawn. Feel your limbs sink deeper into rest, your body unbothered, unburdened, your thoughts softened by distance. Whether they flew through poppy fields or twirled through Strasbourg, they're calm now. Still, you are in no danger. The world outside may be crooked and chaotic, but here, in this quiet little space, you are untouchable, safe, exactly where you need to be. So breathe, just breathe, in and out, like the slow rhythm of a monk's chant, like the swing of a censer, like the rise and fall of medieval laughter under a harvest moon. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to make sense of it. Just know that people lived through it. They survived it. And somehow, so did you. Close your eyes. Let the darkness hold you gently. Sleep well, time traveler.